This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.
South Africa's mobile telecoms are huge, right? Almost everyone has a phone. Most people access the internet through the phone, the mobile device. Vodacom, MTN, Telkom, Cell C control the infrastructure that powers communication, banking, even government services. I mean, these phone companies, these mobile companies, mobile telecoms are huge. Over the past few months, we've been highlighting the Open Secrets series of reports titled Who Owns South Africa? And the first report unpacked how a powerful few control our economy and politics, while the second looked at the private control of healthcare. The latest report, this is the third installment, looks at Private Telecoms. It uncovers how just a few corporations, that's MTN, Vodacom, Telkom, and Cell C, dominate the sector and profit from essential communication services. To unpack this further, we're joined by Senior Investigator at Open Secrets, Raisa Pather. So, Raisa, good morning and salam alaikum to you.
Hi, good morning. Alaikum salam.
So, this is yet again another very deep, wide, unpacking of these telecoms. Shocking to actually learn about how influential they are and how much they control and how much they influence our lives. And the latest WOSA report reveals that South Africa's mobile telecoms industry is dominated by just a few major players. Can you walk us through how this duopoly came to be?
Yes. So thank you so much. It's very interesting because I think, the purpose of the series is essentially this, that, we have various sectors in the South African economy that is just controlled by a handful of companies. And in the South African telecom sector, we see three big players that very clearly emerge. The first is Vodacom, which holds the biggest share of the South African market. They control about 42%. So they're one of the biggest players in South Africa. The second is MTN, which holds just over 30% of the market. And so they're the second biggest player in South Africa. And both Vodacom and MTN, they also have a little bit of an international presence in the sense that they also have operations across the African continent. And in MTN's case, they also have operations in the Middle East. The third biggest player is Telkom, which has a 90% share of the South African telecoms market. And when we say this, we're particularly looking at their share because of the number of subscribers they have. So these three big companies have the majority of subscribers in South Africa. And together, they control about 90% of the South African market. I think it's also interesting to note that in the previous financial year, they paid almost 20 billion rand in dividends to their shareholders, which just goes to show, the amount of profits that they make over a service that we argue in our report should work in the public interest and should, be owned in a way by a sort of more public ownership model.
The report highlights the historical roots of inequality in telecoms access, how the legacy of apartheid has actually shaped today's mobile communication landscape. I was a little surprised when you said that Telkom was 19%. We've all known historical Telkom. But in terms of the Telkom access and the legacy of apartheid, how it shaped it, help us understand this landscape now.
Right. I think that's a great question. I mean, as we show in the report, it even predates apartheid, right? Like during the colonial era in the late 19th century, there was the development and emergence of the telegraph, which colonial settler colonies used as a way to expand their settler colonialism in Africa and other parts of the world. So, we have this famous image of Cecil John Rhodes holding a telegraph line as he stands spread out across the African continent, essentially, from Cape Town to Cairo, that famous saying of Cecil Rhodes that he would colonize the continent from Cape Town to Cairo. And really, the British used the telegraph as a way of communicating with their emissaries across the different colonies and to expand their colonial expansion. What we see during apartheid was that the landline services that were developed during the apartheid era, they were racially divided and skewed in terms of access. So Telkom, which was controlled by the apartheid communications government department, it was largely responsible for the telecom sector at that time. And at that time, we saw that 1 in 4 white South Africans or white people in South Africa had access to landline services. They could use these services for their businesses, etc. Whereas only 1 in 50 Black people in South Africa had the same access to landline services. So again, we see this power dynamic in the use of telecoms. What is interesting today is that in 1994, right, Vodacom and MTN were granted the first mobile operating licenses, these telecoms operating licenses that we still have today.
These? Yeah, go ahead. Vodacom and MTN?
Yeah, they were granted the first licensing operations in the form that we see today of these mobile telecom services. And with the advent of MTN and Vodacom and mobile telecoms, Black people in South Africa have actually grown their access to telecom services, right? So we now see through the Stats SA reports that over 90% of households in South Africa have a working mobile phone. And as a result of that, Stats SA says that this has contributed to more than 80% of people in South Africa having access to internet and communication and information services that they never previously had easy access to before. And this is why we believe that this evolution of access to mobile telecoms is so important. And it's also why we believe that we need to kind of look very closely at how this industry is owned and who is profiting from it.
That report focused also on, MTN and Vodacom, but it focused on uncovering relationships and ownership structures and political connections. I think this is a very important thing to sort of, highlight are those relationships and the ownership structures and big politics. How did they come together in the report?
I think what we look at mostly is how very key people within the boards of these companies are very well politically connected. So I think MTN is a great example of this. And through the course of this year, there have been various controversies around the MTN board and certain political decisions that have been made. So we know, for example, that Cyril Ramaphosa, before he became the deputy president of the ANC, was the chairperson of the MTN board. He was now the chairperson of the MTN board is now Nsbisi Jonas. And just this year, Ramaphosa appointed Jonas to be the special envoy to the US. And this was a very interesting development because at the moment, MTN has been caught in this proxy political ideological battle between the West and its political beliefs around the Middle East. And MTN has operations in Iran, which has been the particular focus of these proxy political battles with certain U.S. politicians saying that, MTN should face investigations over its operations in the Middle East and that it has connections to what they term as terrorists in the Iranian government, right? And MTN has denied these allegations, but its competitor in Iran, Turkcell, which had competed for an Iranian license to operate in that country, Turkcell said that MTN had leveraged its political connections to score a multi-billion-dollar deal in Iran, which for us was interesting. We've never seen that these allegations have been proven. They have yet to be tested in a court of law. But it's definitely concerning that for some companies and particularly corporations, mega corporations, political wheeling and dealing is seen as the cost of doing business. Whereas we believe, that political connections and political influence should be used in the public interest, not necessarily in the influence of companies and their interests. And then I think it's also interesting just to mention, that there have been internet shutdowns that telecoms companies often obey government requests to do internet shutdowns. They are contractually obligated to do this, but there are serious human rights concerns. Vodacom in the DRC abided by requests from the Kabila government to shut down the internet during times of protest where Kabila was trying to unconstitutionally extend his term in power. So these are all very serious concerns that have very real consequences for the public and for people and human rights.
Yeah, that was actually my next question. I was going to do a follow-up with you on looking at some of those striking findings, the role that these companies have in internet shutdowns across Africa and parts of the Middle East. And you've already touched on it. in some cases, these are shutdowns that are unconstitutional, perhaps in those countries. Maybe they help perpetuate human rights abuses. This is just not acceptable. But again, we are complicit in it. So does that not, by extension, imply that South Africa, is complicit in some of these violations in other countries as well?
Well, I think there's a big question about how companies and corporations and multinational companies are regulated. So in international law, for example, there seems to be a gap in how companies can face accountability for their actions in a court of law. I mean, the MTN case, right? So I think MTN, you mentioned internet shutdowns in Africa, and I think, it's particularly important to mention that right now there has been horrific news coming out of Sudan because of the RSF's expansion and occupation of territories in Sudan, which has led to further massacres and, just really horrific news that we've seen unfolding. And MTN has been implicated. They have shut down internet services in Sudan during pivotal moments. And we don't always know where the order is coming from. So as I said earlier, often it's governments who make these requests. But we've seen before in other examples that when other groups occupy territories through force and violence, MTN has also obeyed request to shut down the internet. And this seemed to have happened, for example, in Afghanistan, where there were certain regions that were controlled by the Taliban, and MTN abided by a request to shut down the internet. And so this is why I think the development, Open Secrets really believes that the development of international law is really important around these issues so that corporations can have a space in international law to be held to account. In terms of South Africa, in the MTN case in particular, there is a constitutional court case that will very soon be heard about the allegations that MTN has faced in Iran. These don't really deal with MTN's internet shutdowns in Iran. I think the most well-known case of shutdowns in Iran would have come during the Mahsa Amini protests, where women, children, families took to the streets in Iran to protest the killing of Mahsa Amini by Iranian security forces because, as they alleged, she was wearing improper hijab, and so she was killed. And so, MTN has really never faced accountability for its role in obeying orders to shut down the internet. But what we might see play out in the Constitutional Court is perhaps a way to pave the way for the courts in South Africa to hear allegations that MTN may have obtained its license in Iran through potential corrupt means, as alleged by its competitor Turkcell.
All right, so that's something we need to keep our ears to the ground on. That's going to be an interesting development in the courts. You argue that telecoms should be treated as a public service or for the public good rather than a private commodity. What would that look like in practice? Why is it so important?
So, I mean, at the moment, Telkom is largely, it is largely a publicly owned entity. I don't think many people know too much about Telkom's ownership because I think for most people, it's just taken for granted that this is a state-owned entity because historically it has always been through. But just to give some perspective, at the moment, the Department of Communications in government owns around 40% of Telkom, and the PIC, the Public Investment Corporation, owns about 10%. So together, this gives at least 50% control to the state. There are certain private companies which also have a stake in ownership, and this includes PSG, the Vanguard Group, which is the very famous US headquartered asset management company, and then Sanlam also has a stake in Telkom, but these are all minority shares. So for us, it is interesting to see that Telkom is majority state owned, but I guess what we're arguing for is a fairer model of ownership where access to telecoms is not a for-profit endeavor. We have to treat these services as being in the public interest where companies must not put their profit first and where instead, the public interest should come first. And I think this is particularly interesting when we talk, for example, about how certain telecoms companies provide financial services, which maybe we'd get into later. But we can see that companies, these telecoms companies, are increasing and expanding their financial service offerings, essentially becoming pseudo banks. And in that way, they're also offering services that profit from the transactions of poor people instead of holding the public interest first so that more people can have fair access to telecom services without having to pay outrageous costs, for example, for data and other services.
Yeah, and the report does talk about the financialization of telecoms, especially through platforms like Momo and VodaPay, and there are risks that is introduced here when these companies become financial service providers. They're supposed to be telecoms, right? So are they losing money on the telecom side and trying to make up for it on the financial side? What are the risks of sort of intermingling these services? We're putting so many eggs in one basket, and are we not empowering these telecoms to a much greater degree because we are putting our financial dependence and the movement of money through their systems as well? Are we not setting ourselves up here to be managed and controlled by a few companies?
Yeah, I mean, I think this is the interesting question, So in terms of revenue, I think most of MTN's revenue still comes from voice and data services. But its revenue from Momo, its platform, which is short for mobile money, is increasing, So we're seeing that this is in the top three biggest earners for MTN out of the service products that it provides. And I think the interesting question to be raised here is, yes, it's about the expanding influence of these telecoms companies, but also it's about evaluating whether the fintech that these telecom companies is providing is actually beneficial or whether it is perpetuating certain harms. So I think, in the case of Vodacom, yes, in South Africa, Vodacom has the VodaPay app, which is it has a huge subscriber base and it's widely expansive in the country. And this particularly makes sense when you consider that Vodacom is the biggest telco in the country. But when you look, for example, at Kenya, there's a service in Kenya called M-Pesa, which is a fintech platform. It is owned by Vodacom and Safaricom, which is a local Kenyan company. And M-Pesa is widely influential, right? There has been research done on this model. So essentially, this service allows people to take out loans. They can borrow money in a more formal financial setting from this financial service provider, M-Pesa. And it also allows them to take out loans from family or friends, etc. It also offers betting services. It offers other essential financial services that most financial companies offer. But what researchers have found is that while telecoms companies say that these mobile financial tech companies are, financially inclusive, that they're allowing poor people and vulnerable people to access financial service that they wouldn't otherwise have, research has shown that actually these services can, one, exacerbate debt among the poor, which is of serious concern, and also exacerbate harmful betting that has already been quite endemic and harmful in Kenya. We can also see this emerging in South Africa, where there's more conversation around the harms of gambling and betting in the country. I think for us, the biggest point to make about telco fintech models is that essentially they allow these corporations to profit from the transactions of the poor. So we believe that these services are widely extractive and exploitative because for every transaction that a person makes using these services, which target the poor, these mobile telecoms companies are raking in a fee and a profit of these transactions. And again, this shouldn't be happening. We need a fairer model of access to financial services that doesn't allow corporations to benefit of the transactions of people who are already economically vulnerable.
Right. They are situations where people have this pay-as-you-go, phone. Well, it's not a contract, but it's pay-as-you-go basically, and sometimes they can make calls or use data beyond what their limit states, and then when you load new money or new data, package onto the phone, they actually have to pay off old debt. So it's not actually money It's actually a debt in the form of a service. You are indebted because you've gone over your minutes or over your data, and you can incur penalties, but it gets extracted in the form of back pay for data and stuff. And I know some people are shocked and surprised when they load their data or they load their minutes. They realize that, I still have to pay my debt from the previous month or the previous instance. And I guess encouraging people to fall into debt and not making it equally accessible for everybody. Cell C's story is quite different from the other major players. What lessons can we learn from the rise, fall, and the attempted revival of Cell C?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Cell C at the moment, they don't have a wide subscriber base in South Africa. I think, they only have 7% of the market share, which is quite low in comparison to the big three companies, Telkom, Vodacom, and MTN, which own that major, over 90% stake in the market. But Cell C is having a re-emergence. So there was a time where Cell C was popular. It was very well known that people would have a Cell C contract. But then after a while, Cell C started to kind of withdraw. It started losing subscribers, and the company started to essentially go down. And it also entered into financial difficulties, which really, led to more difficulties for the company. And so what we saw is that, in around 2017, there were two companies that kind of took a stake in Cell C, a major 60% in the companies. And the first was Blue Label Telecoms. Blue Label is a big South African company that essentially has a digital fingerprint in almost every transaction we make on our phones or on our computers, right? So they have a large fintech presence, and they have software and other technology that is widely used for services, for digital services in South Africa. The other company was Net1. Now, Net1 is an interesting company because they had their fair share of controversy during the social grant scandal, and there was the Constitutional Court ruling made against them. Net1 is now called Lusaka, and together Net1 and Blue Label kind of bought a 60% stake in Cell C in around 2017. So far, we've seen that Lusaka has sort of been withdrawing their stake in Cell C, but Blue Label is starting to increase their stake and sees a lot of potential in Cell C and are kind of trying to reinvigorate the company. So it might soon emerge that, maybe Cell C will become a big player in the South African telecom space. But this would still create a situation where essentially, you're still sitting with a handful of corporations who have a major stake in the market. And I think, as we said earlier, we'd prefer a model that is more equitable, that sort of equalizes access to telecom services, which we believe, is essential for the realization of human rights in the country. I mean, when we look at how telecoms services are accessed, I think sometimes, we don't see telecoms as important as other basic services. But it's important to note, that people need their phones to, for example, look up their nearest doctor, to find their nearest hospital, to even contact emergency services. And that's why, even though, Cell C might emerge as a big player and sort of widen the market for how many players are there, we still think that there should be a limitation on private ownership in the sector.
Telkom, as you pointed out earlier, is still partially state-owned, right? I think we said 50% state-owned, the SOE, the PIC. How does this role differ from the fully private telcos? What challenges does it face in this competitive market?
Yeah, I think it is slightly different in the sense that Telkom is the only state-owned entity. But interestingly, as we see, even though they are mostly a state-owned entity, their market reach in South Africa isn't as big. And even though they have that kind of public ownership, Telkom has had its fair share of scandals. So there were two very well-known people who at one point were at the helm of Telkom. The first was Jabba Mabuza, who was the chairperson of Telkom and a very well-connected politician in the ANC. The second was Sipho Maseko, who was also the CEO of Telkom and also, again, very well connected to the ANC. And like other telcos, Telkom itself has faced scrutiny because of its political connections. So I think the most well-known case, for example, is that Sipho Maseko, the former CEO, is one of the people who was alleged to have allowed Jacob Zuma to have introduced Jacob Zuma to Bain and Company, the big consulting firm who has since been banned from government contracts in South Africa because of their role in state capture and the almost collapse of SARS, the South African Revenue Service. And so, the introduction of Zuma to these officials at Bain, including Bain's former South African CEO, Vittoria Mazzoni, it was a pivotal moment. And it's interesting that Maseko is implicated in that. It's also interesting that in 2013, Bain received a very lucrative 91 million rand contract for Telkom. And then a year later, in 2014, they received an almost 200 million rand contract at Telkom. And these were later the subject of an investigation. And, Maseko had a big role in allowing these contracts to go through. So even though Telkom has this big public ownership, that in itself hasn't meant that the company has acted any differently in terms of its political connections from MTN and Vodacom. It has faced the same kind of scrutiny and interest. And, this is a sense, I guess, that a wholly public ownership of companies still means that we need to scrutinize. It might not be the perfect model of ownership. And particularly when we look at the role of governments in internet shutdowns, there is a lack of trust that we can sort of rely on governments to use these services in the public interest if it was publicly owned, which is why, we don't make a specific recommendation on what a public ownership looks like. Instead, we refer to other organizations and agencies who have been doing long-running work in this environment and offer a lot more insight onto what fairer models of ownership may look like.
So you actually opening up a can of worms here in terms of governance and oversight. Is it your assessment then, or your analysis, that regardless of whether these telcos, and I mean this could be any other major entity in the country, does it matter whether they are state-owned entities or private entities? We can have all the governance and oversight mechanisms in place, but when we have high-profile players like high-ranking political officials who sit on the boards of these companies, whose job it is to provide that governance and accountability, when they are corrupted, and when they are corrupt at multiple levels, collusion is the name of the game. And when you have collusion, it defeats the purpose of governance and oversight, as it rises up through the hierarchy. What's the point then? I mean, are we going to win this eventually?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think, governments can be corrupt, but so can corporations in their own right? It's just that I think often governments, at least there are mechanisms to scrutinize government through parliaments and other authorities, whereas often we don't see the same type of regulations around private and corporate ownership. And I think essentially that this is a big problem. I mean, even when you look at, state capture in South Africa, like how many corporations have really been implicated and held to account for their role? And it's true, state officials also haven't been held to account, but at least, in our media and in other public platforms, we know who the state players are. But I think, there's still a lot of learning and awareness that needs to be done on the corporate players, even though the Zondo Commission, did look at some of those players. And, as Open Secrets, we've written reports around that as well. So I think, the corruption on the government side is bad. It is also bad in the role of the corporations and the private entities and people who run these corporations. I think when you talk about fairer models of ownership, there is a way to go about it. I don't think it's completely hopeless. I mean, there's a collective called the Yetu Collective, which looks at sort of community models of community ownership models, sort of like co-ops, and how communities can take a forward role in owning their own telecom services. So these things are possible. I think it's also important for us, when we talk about the regulation and ownership of telcos, it ties into our infrastructure for accountability in South Africa. and the need to strengthen that on the whole. We need a strong parliament that will call MTN, Vodacom, and Telkom in to answer questions about their role in enabling potential human rights violations across the world. We also need a strong court system and strong legislation that allow us to hold these companies to account. And I think on that score in particular, the MTN case will be a sort of litmus test for what is possible when it comes to holding corporations to account. And we will very keenly follow that story next year and see what happens in Concord.
Well, Raisa, I want to introduce you maybe to a somewhat controversial segue into this matter, the matter of accountability and governance, right? Oversight. If we look at what's happening in the US, for example, when we have politicians that are part of the collusion and the corruption, we're talking about criminal level stuff, right? And we draw parallels to what's happening in South Africa when you have high-ranking officials. If we contrast what's happening in the Madlanga Commission, for example, where you have private corporations, a private enterprise funding political officials and at multiple levels, right? So, the one level is supposed to provide oversight over the level below it. The level below it's supposed to provide accountability or hold levels below it to account. But if you corrupt individuals or officials at multiple levels, where do we go from there? Can Parliament be trusted to provide that level of governance and oversight?
Right. So I think there are, I think in the wake of the state capture years, there have been recommendations made by the Zondo Commission on how to strengthen our accountability institutions in the country. And it's very, so I think it's important to note that, when we talk about accountability in South Africa, we're not starting at scratch. There have been investigations done. There have been recommendations made. And right now, there are committees and, groups that are working on these recommendations that have been made by the Zondo Commission. I think one of them was the Public Office of Integrity, which specifically looks at holding people to account for corruption. And there's also, I think, a new split happening in terms of how we deal with specialized corruption cases. That the Zondo Commission made very specific recommendations in terms of how very serious corruption cases are investigated. And, maybe the fact that the Hawks will no longer be investigating those cases as we have in the system today. So there is a potential restructuring that is underway. And so we need to follow those processes and to see what is happening and make informed criticism based on the processes that are unfolding. But I think, this is a public awareness campaign that needs to be done. We need to know what reforms are taking place, what recommendations from the Zondo Commission are being implemented, and how they are being implemented. I think it's also a pivotal time right now because the NPA head, Shamila Batoy, will soon be vacating office, and the presidency, it's very late, the presidency by now should have already initiated the process of interviews for the next NDPP, National Director of Public Prosecutions, to fill Batoy's vacancy. It's really interesting that hasn't happened yet, and we also are watching very keenly, and everybody should be watching very keenly to see who takes up that position. And during Batoy's process to be appointed, the interviews with various candidates, with all the candidates, were made public and were live streamed, and I'm pretty sure that process will happen again this time. So there are ways for the public to be involved and to participate in the accountability institutions that are currently being built and rebuilt. And I think that, that should happen. There should be public participation, and there is a way for people to be involved. We just need to be aware of what's happening in the country and to speak out when there is injustice or when there are concerns.
All right. As we round out this segment, we'll put the last question to you. Your report also touches on the global influence of South African telcos. How do the international operations impact local accountability and regulation? Now, I know we touched on it a little bit when we talked about the political interference and the political influence, but how do the international operations specifically impact the local accountability and regulation?
I think the MTN case speaks very keenly to this. So firstly, for all the telcos, for Telkom, for example, they don't really have much expansion out of South Africa. They tried to expand across the continent, and it was largely unsuccessful. It didn't work out. But so when we talk about the international expansion and conduct of telcos, we're mainly talking about MTN and Vodacom, which, as we spoke about earlier, have both enabled internet shutdowns and potential human rights violation across the continent and in the Middle East. So far, neither of these companies have faced any accountability in South Africa for their role in internet shutdowns. So this is something that should definitely change. There should be more organization, more regulation in South Africa to say, hey, these companies are headquartered here. They should be held to account for their conduct overseas. And on the case of MTN, I think, again, that Concord case will be particularly interesting to see if MTN will, first of all, if the allegations against MTN for its conduct in Iran, in terms of how it scored its contract, whether it used corrupt means, we'll see, hopefully, that the evidence in that case will be tested and we will know what was true and what was false in terms of Turkcell's allegations. The one thing about internet shutdowns, though, is that these are contractual obligations that are often included in the contracts between state regulators in different regions and the telecoms company. So often, internet shutdowns are just taken as the cost of doing business. It's something that the telcos, are seen to have to do because they are contractually obligated to do so. What we are calling for, along with various organizations around the world, including the Access Now Coalition, is that, telcos need to be regulated for internet shutdowns. And certainly I think that this would be a good reason for Parliament, for example, to bring MTN and Vodacom forward and make them answer questions about their role, especially because right now, in international law, there isn't really a mechanism to deal with this.
Yeah, I think that is indeed very complicated because, like you say, the cost of doing business, the foreign government, the international government would require them to agree to shutting down parts of the internet or to shut down traffic through their networks, on demand as a condition of doing business in that country. So I guess they would not be found guilty of anything in country because it was requested by the government. But in South Africa, like you say, we could most likely look at some sort of accountability for South African companies, committing these types of shutdowns in other countries when it violates people's rights and when we are in violation of any other kind of human dignity as a result of it. So I think this is something that we will have to unpack in the future. And the Zondo Commission that you talked about, another very interesting point, we need to look at that commission as well, because this public integrity, the Office of Public Integrity, something that we really, really lack, and we need that as an independent public integrity office, because clearly we can see that our politicians and certain high-ranking members and officials in the country can't be trusted. They just can't be trusted, and that's why having an independent public integrity commission, free of political influence, maybe operating from the public for the public good, might be the best way to look at this. We want to thank you this morning, Raisa, for your time. We hope you do have an excellent day for the rest of the day. And that is the senior investigator at Open Secrets, Raisa Pather.
This podcast is brought to you by Radio 786.